Well, welcome to the South Carolina Trade Talk podcast. I'm Dr. David Laplace at the Tommy and Victoria Baker School of Business at the Citadel. Welcome, Dr. Richard Ebeling, the BB&T Distinguished Professor of Ethics and Free Enterprise Leadership here at the Citadel.
It's great to be with you today. Thanks for having me participate.
That's great. Again, thank you. Thanks for being here. We really would appreciate Richard. So, as you know, Brexit just happened. Yet there are a lot of talks about renegotiations of this agreement between the United Kingdom and European Union. So tell us a little bit about, do you believe that renegotiating this, is that really free enterprise, and why not? And what your thoughts might be on that?
Well, I understand the reasons why a slim majority of the British population supported Brexit. And if I can just mention, it was hardly uniform. In England and in Wales, there was about 53% who voted for separation from the European Union. But in fact, majorities in both Scotland and Northern Ireland and the Greater London area were for remaining in the EU. So it was extremely controversial and heatedly debated among the citizens of the UK. But the fact is that many in Britain felt that while the ideal of a unified trading area had had a lot of benefits and perks, free movement of goods and services, no barriers in goods moving between the borders of countries, similar sort of a taxing structure. But the fact is that and actually free movement of people. Anyone who as a visitor traveled in Europe before the European Union really developed several decades ago knows the frustration that every time you crossed a border, you got stopped. And like in a movie, they wanted to see your papers, your passport. So the idea that moving across the countries of the European Union became as easy and simple as driving your country across the state lines within the United States was obviously a great boon. But nonetheless, in Brussels, there had been developing and has developed a large, very centralized and intrusive bureaucracy of regulations, controls, restrictions, demands. And this is a bureaucracy that has seemed in the eyes of many, and not just in the UK, as sort of undemocratic, not responsive or answerable to the individual citizenries of the countries, but sort of a top-down central planning agency, if you will, that hampered, intruded, infringed, in fact, prevented a greater degree of actual free enterprise and free trade among the member nations. And as a and the fact that since the European Union redistributes taxed income so much between the member countries, well, there are net paying countries and net receiving countries. And of course, that creates a degree of animosity among the respective citizens of the country. Why don't I get more? Why do I have to give so much to cover the expenses of another country, such as in let's say, to Greece and so on? So I understand the motives of it. The difficulties has emerged in the following way, David, as I have followed it. On the one hand, the European Union bureaucratic structure, those who manage the Union, have felt that if Britain could leave the Union peacefully and without too much of a disruption of the UK's economic relationships with the rest of the Union, well, if Great Britain can move out of the restrictions and regulations that it doesn't like, but still have a lot of the perks and advantages, well, why don't we have a referendum? And well, country X and country Y and country Z, and suddenly the structure falls apart. And the two aspects of that is, well, if you believe in this sort of common area, that's disheartening to you. But there's also the fact that the more the European Union would contract in membership size, the less control the bureaucrats in their own self-interest now have remaining over their oversight, if you will. Mm-hmm. So in my view, the EU negotiating structure has been very, let's see, what's the word I'm looking for? Attempting to punish the British, all right? no, you can't do that. No, if you want to do this, you have to accept that. And the British themselves have not been sure exactly what they want. And the disputes of the movement of goods and people between the two parts of Ireland is a clear case of that. As far as renegotiating, the European Union began, like the old European community began meaning to be a free trade zone.
Mhm.
Well, if you want to be a free trade zone, the renegotiation is a very simple matter. From day X, all barriers, restrictions, and prohibitions on the peaceful and free movement of goods and services across the respective borders are now eliminated. And you now have tax uniformity of whatever the taxes are in the lowest members country, that's the taxes in the other countries as well. A uniform low tax with no hindrances on cross-border investments and, to be honest, continuing relative movement of people. That's all that's required for negotiation. But unfortunately, the Brussels bureaucrats, nor a good number in the UK, are willing to follow that path. So what you have is managed trade. It's managed trade to a great extent within the EU, and now it's the negotiating over all the stringencies and particulars of managed trade between the EU and the UK.
Well, I think that brings a good point, Richard. So how should free enterprise, so that's your area of interest and obviously a passion on the teaching and the research that you do. So free enterprise and international trade. So how should they cooperate? So, is there such a thing as really being able to have a free environment of government controls in that way?
It depends upon what we mean by government controls. If we ask ourselves, what are the minimum functions that we expect of a government if a government is going to exist, that virtually all of us would accept? Well, the government is there to see that we don't kill each other. That's a major social faux
I
pas.
certainly hope so.
A government is there to see that we don't steal from each other, that we don't cheat, defraud, or con each other, right? Misrepresentation. And even people of honest goodwill can have disputes. So adjudication of disputes among the citizens concerning contracts, property transfers, et cetera, et cetera. So imagine that those just are the minimum, okay? Then all you say is that all other things that people want to do, as long as it's peaceful and mutually agreeable, voluntary, is a free trade and free enterprise system. You don't kill, you don't steal, and to use a biblical phrase, you don't bear false witness, you don't cheat or defraud. But if you do those three things, the difficulty is that governments have grown far beyond that, of course, which is a huge political dispute. How far do you think should be the intrusive role of government in the economic and social spheres of everyday life? But the fact that the government now does so much more, from different types and forms and degrees of regulation, types and forms of fiscal policy, of taxing, types and forms of macro policy in terms of economy-wide fluctuations in the economy. Once this is overlaid, those minimal functions that all people could sort of agree about if there's going to be a government, you then have all these differences of opinion. If you just look within the European Union, there are complaints that the government in Hungary is not being as respectful of certain constitutional and civil liberty issues. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, they don't like things that go on in France or Italy, perhaps in different areas. So once you have this, once government is overlaid in so many areas of life, economic, social, personal, you invariably prevent free trade from effectively operating, because all free trade is extending across borders the principles we take for granted within a country like the United States. The buying and selling of goods relatively freely from Washington State to Florida, from Maine to New Mexico, and everything in between. That's a free trade zone, and free movement of people and free movement of goods across those state lines. But once you have all these multiple layers, all these problems arise. And so, yes, you can easily have free trade with free enterprise. That's how it all developed and emerged in the 19th century as government involvements were diminishing under a sort of a free market notion of liberalism of the 19th century. But as long as these governments are overlaid in these ways and conflicting visions, it's going to be very difficult to have what you may be practicing as relatively free enterprise at home and be able to fully extend it across borders because of these conflicts between what governments are doing and the degree to which they're doing it.
Well, that is interesting, and I guess very quickly. So, what do you think is your prediction of trade agreements looking in the future? What will be the trends, if I may call? I'm not asking you to predict the future, but what do you see people looking for in light of the conversation you just talked about?
Well, I have found that one of the most difficult things to predict is the unpredictable. That was the definition, right?
Yeah.
So whenever anyone is asked that kind of question on these type of economic, in this case, global policy issues, it's a very cloudy crystal ball. So you're saying, well, given trends and attitudes that you see in society today, well, if they were to continue,
Mm-hmm.
I think what we're seeing is the rise of state-dominated market economies through models challenging even the degree of relatively free enterprise we have in the United States. I'm thinking of countries especially like China or the post-Soviet Russia. There are political agendas that these countries have as well as economic ones. So the difficulty of the idea of the world having a restored or a renewed or improved really free trade global economy, I think is going to be very difficult to implement. And again, without seeming to talk too long, David, the Chinese in particular are attempting to play a 19th century imperialist game where they want to establish close economic exploitation, if I can use that term, over a wide number of countries in what used to be called the Third World, Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, the Caribbean, where they want to have mercantilist-like monopoly accesses to resources that they view as essential to their domestic further industrialization. And at the same time, play their own version of gunboat diplomacy with setting up sort of, these franchise rights to control ports and even some military bases like in Djibouti in the Horn of Africa. And with that sort of protectionist, neo-mercantilist, government managed industrial policy in China, it's very difficult to have a globally accepted free trade agreement. Then the other difficulty is that what's going to happen with global warming? Now, the presumption is that global warming is occurring, which of course not everybody agrees with. And then the idea is how to solve it. Even if we are saying there is global warming and human behavior is doing something that's intensifying it, what do you do about it? And there's no uniformity of that. So how do you have these types of trade enhancing agreements when we in the United States say we're going to try to diminish fossil fuel use, but the Chinese are saying, well, we're going to keep having more coal burning energy sources, and maybe we'll cut back, towards the middle of the 21st century. And then finally, there's a general illiberalism that I believe is being influenced by, but again, you can't say how much it's going to be a continuing legacy, is the COVID crisis. Borders have been closed in the name of health concerns, a collapse of the tourist industry, supply chain breakages, and the difficulty of restoring them. And every time a new variant of COVID arises, there's new lockdowns. And so the ability to have a smoothly functioning global economy, the way we more or less were having compared to what we've been experiencing now, I hope it gets restored, but I think it's going to be very difficult. And then if I could just make one other point about this, David. So let's suppose that COVID and these other tendencies make a restoration and a refinement of a really more interconnected and interdependent and smoothly functioning global economy be possible. I fear that then countries are going to find, because of supply chain uncertainties, political uncertainties from China and other countries, maybe it's better that it's homespun. That is, greatest domestic self-sufficiency. The difficulty is that once countries follow that route, you are then losing all the advantages that we talk about, division of labor. That's why we want free trade, a global division of labor. Some people in a different country halfway around the world can make something better or cheaper or at all that we can't make at home. And by selling them something that we can do better than them, we both gain. But if now we attempt to make things in our respective hothouse protected economies, we all suffer from, if not falling standards of living, stagnant or standards of living growing a lot less rapidly as otherwise would have been the case. And the poorer countries, which we say we empathetically are concerned with, would suffer the most from this.
That's insightful. Well, really, thank you so much, Dr. Ebeling, for sharing your insight on the trade and free enterprise. Join us next month for our next episode of the South Carolina Trade Talk. I wanted to again thank the Tommy and Victoria Baker School of Business for hosting this podcast, and have a great day.